Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud. And we are joined this morning by Rabbi Ari Sachs to steer us around the last 7 dapim in Bava Batra.
That's right.
Rabbi Sachs, let's get right into it.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all here. I am in the middle. I actually just put into the chat a copy of the text that we're going to be looking at for this week, and as well that the topic that we're going to be talking about, I think lends itself to an interesting conversation. So please feel free to share some thoughts that you might have over the chat board, and that Rachel will kind of help moderate it for me so that we can have some conversation about the topic at hand. With that in mind, just would like to offer a bracha as we begin. The bracha for learning, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So
Amen.
with that in mind, the topic that we have in hand, and if you've been here when I've taught before, I've often liked to talk about the structure of Talmud and how it's been organized, because I think that even more than just the content, the way in which Talmud talks about the content is just so fascinating, as it brings up so many different elements of how we pass along information from generation to generation and what are the most important values. That being said, there's also a ton of content to talk about. And in this particular set of this particular set of dapim, which if I don't actually have the, hold on one second. It is, if I'm remembering correctly, it's dapim 129 to 135 or so from Masechet Bava Batra. That the main topic that it discusses is inheritance and gifts. That is to say that when one is about to pass away, when you're about to die, that you have an opportunity to be able to pass along your all of your possessions to the next generation, and that there are two ways to kind of do that. One is through the act of your inheritors inheriting what you have, and the other is by giving gifts to individuals. Now, just in terms of thinking about the relevance of it today, I saw a fact very recently that I thought was really fascinating along these lines, which is that the millennial generation, of which I'm an older member of the millennial generation, is about to become the wealthiest generation in all of American history. The way in which that's happening is not by the work that they have done or that we have done, but by virtue of the inheritance that our generation is collectively receiving from previous generations. Very often when we talk about the values of an economy, that when people are talking about how they can be able to better live and to make sure that they have a leg up for just to be able to survive and to persevere and to thrive, they talk about the idea of generational wealth, that when someone is able to really succeed, that you're able to pass along that success to the next generation. So the idea of inheritance, the idea of gift giving from one generation to the next, not just when one has passed away, but even when one is alive, is such an important part of what makes a strong economy. And in many ways also makes a strong set of ties between one generation and another. As you might expect, it could also be very challenging and very difficult, especially if some people think that they deserve to inherit as opposed to others. So that's kind of where this conversation, I want to kind of frame it in terms of how money and how possessions get passed along from one generation to the next. And I think there's some really fascinating insights that our text talks about here. So with that, we're going to kind of jump on in. And with that in mind, in terms of jumping on in, I wanted to start by really talking about, I'm just going to bring this, let me make sure I got it right. You can still see it?
We can see it.
Great. So I want to actually start kind of at the end, which is to define the terms of Yerusha, which is the Hebrew for inheritance, and of matana, which is the Hebrew for a gift. But before we kind of get into the specifics of those different terms, I want you to know that it's not just any kind of matana that we're talking about, especially in our sugyot. Rather, it's what's called a matanat shchiv mera, a gift of a person on his deathbed. Because if you think about what it means to give a gift, especially as it relates to or how it differentiates from inheritance, it's about what happens when someone at the end of their life decides, I want to be able to give this gift that people are going to receive after I die. So, in many ways, it is like an inheritance, but there's also some really key differences that we're going to take a look at. So, those are the two different things that we're going to be focusing on, this idea of matanat shchiv me'era, a gift a person receives on his deathbed, and the idea of Yerusha. And I want to bring in Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz's definitions of these terms at the beginning because I think it's going to be helpful. And then I'm going to pause if there's any questions about these different definitions before we get into the actual text themselves, when we're going to take a look at primarily a couple of different cases for us to consider. So the first is, and you can kind of see it on your page, and I'm not going to necessarily read it line by line, but that when it comes to Yerusha, when it comes to inheritance, there's a text from Numbers chapter 27, we're going to take a look at in a second, of where this particular law comes from. Some major points. First, according to Torah, father's property is inherited by his sons. The firstborn gets a double share. Second, if the deceased had no sons, then the daughters would be able to receive it. And also has also no other heirs, which is important. And we'll actually talk about that in a moment. By the way, the context of Numbers chapter 27 in verses 1-7 is the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, in which they petition Moses to be able to receive the inheritance from their father. But important to note in that story is that he had no other heirs to potentially receive his inheritance. And therefore, that's when they said, you're just going to lose his connection to his tribe, and therefore we should receive it. So even though the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad is that women are able to receive inheritance, it's only after all of the other potential heirs you've gone through and realize that there's no one left, which leads to number 3. If he has no offspring at all, the inheritance passes to his father and then to his father's heirs. That is to say, if, let's say, Moshe, or to do a different example. Let's say Yitzchak Avinu had no heirs, then all of his possessions would actually go back to Avraham, to his father. And if Avraham was not alive, then, or if there were no other heirs connected to Avraham, it would go back to Terach, meaning it goes all the way further back in order to be able to find who is it that's supposed to inherit along a certain kind of line based upon the male offspring or the just the paternal line there. And take a look at this line, which is just important for thinking about the notion of inheritance. It's that the sages laid down the general principle that in the matters of inheritance, quote, a father takes precedence over all his offspring. Av kodem lechol yotzei chalatzav. So to think about what it means to inherit, that it is not just inherently that's going to go to children, but that because of the patriarchal nature of the Torah, no judgment right there, especially at this point, that it follows who the father is and who is supposed to be able to receive it from the father so that his legacy, his name will be able to continue. And even if that means going back a generation, that's more important than necessarily going to the offspring. Okay? We're going to touch on that a little bit later as well. With regard to inheritance, number 4, there's no difference between a legitimate child and a mamzer, who is a child born of a forbidden marriage or out of wedlock, which I think is very interesting if you think about certain stories that we might have in Torah. I'm thinking about this if you are a fan of Game of Thrones, that Jon Snow is considered to be a mamzer. And the question is, would he inherit from his father, even though his father had a certain line? And definitely considering the notion of somebody who is born out of necessarily the same line, that they would not necessarily receive as much. However, that in this case, in regards to the particular line of inheritance, they are still able to receive, even though they are mamzer. Okay. But then this comes back to, or I should say that this all leads to number 5, which is probably the most important line for us in thinking about the role that inheritance plays. The right to inherit is immediate and not dependent on a will. So when someone says, I'm going to write you out of a will, according to Jewish law, that's actually not possible. You cannot write somebody out of a will, because the right to inherit, if you are in that line, if you are following, if you are the firstborn male if you're the firstborn male child, you are automatically going to inherit no matter what happens. And that's sort of as a foundation. Okay. Here is the text that it speaks about. Again, this is after the daughters of Tzlopchad. Numbers chapter 27, verses 8 to 11. Further speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a householder dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. That's because we just have the daughters of Tzlopchad. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. So I made one mistake. It's not that it goes from no male offspring to his father's. So like in the example I gave, from Yitzchak to Abraham, it does not go from Yitzchak to Abraham, but only if there are no other heirs, including female children. So if there are no offspring, that's when it would go to the previous generation. And this shall be the law procedure for the Israelites in accordance with God's command to Moses. All right. So that's Yerusha. Wait, Rachel, I don't hear you actually.
Sorry, Rabbi Sachs, we have a question about spouses. Where do they fit into this inheritance scheme?
So they do not receive an inheritance. They receive a ketubah. So spouses, and the text does talk about that. We're not going to be discussing that right now because they don't actually fall within that category. There is a conversation in our set of dapim about what happens if a woman, if a spouse, if you want to leave more to the spouse, especially at the end of someone's life. So let's say you're about to die and say, I want to leave more to my wife. That's considered to be a gift, a matanat shchiv meira, which then has some complications regarding to a ketubah, because the ketubah is almost like the way in which a woman would inherit from her husband after he dies. So they would not necessarily fall in the line of inheritance. Okay. So now we're going to get to this idea of a gift. By rabbinic decree, gifts given by a person on his deathbed differ in several ways from those given by ordinary people. So again, we're not just talking about a regular gift. First, gift of a person on his deathbed is valid even if no acquisition was being performed. This act of kinyan. Now, I want to just focus on this for a quick moment, because acquisition, or kinyan, is the way in which you know that a transaction has happened. We know this in many ways from the wedding ceremony. When a groom puts a ring upon the finger of his bride and says, Hare at mekudeshet li, that behold, you are consecrated to me, that is in halachic terms, that's an act of kinyan, of acquisition, of a husband receiving his wife. Whether or not you can receive a person, I think that there's certain issues around that we're not going to necessarily go into, but it's the idea that there has to be some show of transfer, because if you're giving a gift, or if you're saying you now take this, you have to be able to show that in some act, with giving a ring in this case. However, especially when someone's on their deathbed, they can't necessarily move, is to say, even if you speak it orally, then it still works. There doesn't have to be an act of acquisition in order to say, I'm giving this gift. Okay, that's going to be important. Then, and this is, I think, really interesting, is that number 2 and 3, a mortally ill person may retract his gift as many times as he wishes. And also, if he recovers, it's invalid. So even if someone's about to die and says, I want to leave you something, I want to leave you all of my property that doesn't go to my heirs, but then they recover and like, oh, you know what? I think I'm okay. I don't want to give that to you. They can retract that. It doesn't have the same validity when it comes to inheritance. So the important thing here is, number 1, that a gift is something that is done voluntarily by the person who's about to die. And number two, it can be retracted, it can be changed, as opposed to inheritance, where not only does it not even have to be stated, it's not only that it cannot be retracted, it doesn't even have to be stated. If you are of a certain status when it comes to inheritance, you are able to receive without needing it to be stated in some kind of document or in some act of acquisition. By the way, the line specifically that refers to gifts actually comes from the entire teaching related to the inheritance. This is the first verse I read earlier. Further speak to the Israelite people as follows: if a householder dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. In the Hebrew, it says "V'ha'avartem et nachalato levito," and then Bava Batra 147a picks up on this language. The term "you shall cause to pass." V'ha'avartem is a hif'il verb, meaning it's saying you cause to pass over. It's not just that it goes to this individual; it's that you cause this property, that this gift to this stuff to go to this individual. Because it says you shall cause to pass, it seems to be superfluous. Why? Because again, inheritance just goes to the next individual. You don't need to cause anything, it just happens. Therefore, because it uses a he-feel verb, because it says you shall cause, you can therefore derive from this term that you have another case of causing property to pass to another, which is comparable to a case of inheritance, and that does not require an act of acquisition. And what is this case? This is the case of the gift of a person on his deathbed, meaning the reason why this term, v'ha'avartem, appears here in regards to inheritance is because a gift that occurs on a deathbed is like an inheritance in the sense that you do not have to have an act of acquisition like any other gift, but it is different than an act of than inheritance, because inheritance, you do not need to cause it to go to the next individual. It just goes. So, and when it comes to a gift, you do have to indicate that this person must receive it. So I'm going to pause here. I know we only have so much time, but I want to see if there's any other particular questions on this. And then we're going to get to a couple of different cases that I think are interesting in regards to how gifts and inheritance kind of play themselves out.
Okay, there's some question about what if the laws of the state regarding inheritance conflict with Jewish laws of inheritance. And
Right.
we already have some discussion of that in the chat, that in most cases, then dina de malchuta dina, the principle that the law of the land is the law of land, would override that. I wonder, and I don't know, maybe you do, Rabbi Sachs, if at this time the sustaining empire didn't feel that it was necessary to dictate laws of inheritance from on high to its peoples, and therefore, communities were making their own determinations about that, or individuals. But I don't have the answer to that. I'm
Right.
sorry.
I would say simply this: throughout the Babylonian and the Roman empires, and I would say even up in some ways to emancipation, that local communities were able to govern themselves as long as it did not conflict with the wills of the state or wills of the empire. That is to say that Jewish law was the law of the land for the Jewish community, which is why these conversations about what is the law is important in regards to the life of individuals within the context of the Jewish community. We even have that today. That is to say, if you live in a very religious community, that sometimes those communities say, we want to be able to follow the law that we have. The difference is, by virtue of living in a free secular society, that if someone wants to, they can go to a court, they can go to a non-Jewish court and get a ruling that is not based on religion at all. By the way, there's a really interesting case of this issue that's done in a more fictional basis, but has some basis in Talmud. If you ever read As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg, there's a great piece in there about one of the things that led up to a major revolt against the Romans, or considered a Roman against the Romans, or a potential revolt against the Romans, focused on Elisha ben Abuya, in which there was a case that went before the Jewish court. The person did not like the answer, and so they went to the Roman court to get a different answer. So it still existed back then, and it is dina de malchuta dina, but I would say that in most cases, especially when we're talking about here, you would start from the Jewish end. You would say the Jewish community has a right to govern themselves, but if there's an issue, then the Roman or the other empires can be able to make a final ruling that might be different. Okay,
And
so
Aaron, a few questions about this whole idea that these gifts can override the Torah's laws of inheritance. So first off, the question was like, are these death pit gifts basically just for that purpose? And I think basically yes, right? Like this is just a system of getting around the rigidity of the Torah's laws around inheritance and making
not
it.
necessarily, no, not so. Actually, that is one of the cases that's here. So let's actually take a look at
All right.
that particular
Good.
issue.
Glad you asked, Aaron. And then
Yeah,
Aaron also wants to know I'll put his other question here. Are there Torah proof texts justifying gifts overriding inheritance rules?
right.
Do they justify their um, overriding of the Torah using text from the Torah?
Right. So let's actually take a look at that in terms of the inheritance or the gift. So this is what I call case law number 2. Comes from Bava Batra 133a that I think will help answer Aaron's question. So start with kind of the basic idea. Rav Huna says with regard to a person on his deathbed who wrote a document granting all his property to another, the court investigates the legal status of the recipient. If he is fit to inherit from him, in other words, if he is one of his sons, he takes the property as an inheritance, and if not, he takes it as a gift. Okay, so that's just, I think, to kind of set the stage. But now we're really going to get into this question about, well, why does it matter if it's an inheritance or a gift? And a lot of that actually has to do with, is there an overriding principle, or is there a time in which one overrides the other? The Gemara asks, to what halacha is there a difference whether he receives it as an inheritance or a gift? Rav Ada bar Ahava, who was in the presence of Rava, thought that it would be correct to say, if he is fit to inherit from him, the giver's widow is sustained from his property, as she has the right to be sustained from inheritance. And if not, and the property was given as a gift, his widow is not sustained from his property. So that's just one area of
That's why
this
it
law.
matters whether it's a gift or inheritance. It's whether she can
Exactly.
take her ketubah from what's promised in her ketubah from that
Right.
property.
To give like an example, my wife is Rachel. Okay, not the Rachel who's here, but my wife's name is Rachel, and we have um let's say I passed away, but before I passed away, I said I want to leave all of my possessions to the shul that I was the rabbi for. Okay, and I say that's what I want. Well, the question is, does the widow actually receive from, does my wife Rachel, who's now a widow, does she take, can she go to the shul and say, you owe me some money because that is partially mine? The answer is no, she cannot. However, the difference is that I must give her ketubah's worth before it goes to the actual, before it goes to back to the shul. So partially may just be a question of when she receives it, because at the end of the day, she still has a right to it. However, there is a notion that if it's a gift, then the person who's receiving the gift is like, it's not my wife, it's not part of my family, so I don't have to sustain her with what has been given to me. Rava said to him, can the widow's right be diminished by the gift? Now that you say, with regard to inheritance, which is granted by Torah law, that his widow is sustained from his property with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed, which is effected without any formal act of acquisition by rabbinic law, all the more so is it not clear that the widow has sustenance rights. Now, this is I was going to spend a little bit of time on this, but given our timing here, we don't really have time. This is kind of like it's a kal vachomer situation, meaning one of the ways in which we learn law is in a stringent situation. If this is the rule, then in a lenient situation, it would also be the rule. So in a stringent situation, meaning according to Torah law, that his widow is sustained from the property, isn't all the more so by rabbinic law, which isn't as strong as Torah law, that she should be sustained by that particular gift, since it kind of acts like an inheritance. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I just wanted to point that out, that that's sort of the way that the rabbis are thinking. Rather, Rava said the difference whether it is an inheritance or a gift is in accordance with the ruling that Rav Acha bar Rav Avia sent. According to the statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, in the case of one who said, my property is given to you, and after you to so-and-so, and the first recipient was fit to inherit from him, the second gets nothing in place of the first, i.e., he does not receive the property after the first one dies. This is the difference between a gift and an inheritance. So if I say that my property is given to, let's say, Shlomo, and then after it goes to Shlomo, it then goes to Shimon, that when I give it to Shlomo, once Shlomo passes away, it then goes to Shimon. However, if Shlomo is my inheritor, this and Shimon has no right to take the property from Shlomo, from the first one who receives it. Why? Because an inheritor, it simply belongs to them, and it then gets passed down through this formula of who are their heirs. That is to say that inheritance trumps gift giving. If you give a gift to somebody who is worthy of inheriting it, then that person who inherits it does not have to pass along that gift to a second individual, even if I, who's about to die, says that I want to give it to that second individual. So let me just kind of play that out for a second. Rather, it was a formulation of inheritance, and inheritance has no end, i.e., it cannot be stopped. Therefore, since the first recipient acquired it as an inheritance, his heirs inherited from him, and it cannot be taken by the second. So, because of our time, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop. But that's something I really want to kind of hone in on. You have this idea of an inheritance, of a Yerusha, that one does not have to be stated in a will, two, that has the power by which, even if I were to state that something should be given as a gift, inheritance trumps a gift, that by virtue of simply just the relationship that we have with one another, that determines how property gets passed from generation to generation. And picking up on the theme that I mentioned at the beginning about the value of inheritance and the value of passing money down from one generation to the next, what Torah is teaching us right now is that the familial ties that we have to one another, the blood ties, so to speak, play a greater, more significant role than just about a sense of connection, but that it speaks to how we are, by virtue of who we are born to and the families that we are born into, that will determine to some extent what our collective destiny is. You cannot get out of inheritance in terms of as an individual, as someone who is inheriting, and you cannot get someone out of inheriting from you if you're the one who wants to give it. By the way, there's a fascinating story that we did not get to, having to do with a case where the son did not want to come to his father's party or something like that, and the father kind of got a way around it, and it has to do with inheritance and a gift. And basically, the idea is that you cannot actually change the foundation of what these relationships are, no matter how difficult it may be, no matter how challenging it may be. This is your family, and we have to live with that, both as the ones who come from previous generations, to say that even though this next generation may not be who we want it to be, they still deserve it, or they still get it because that's what Torah is telling us to do. And that even if we want to make a choice about who receives our property, our possessions, that we have a limited role that we can do with that. It does not overcome those familial ties.
Thank you. And I think we will steal one more minute of your time to get to the last
Absolutely.
question. And that is a good segue into it. Let's just dilate a little more broadly about what kind of society the rabbis are trying to set up with this system of laws. What patterns do you see? What values do you see behind these laws?
I see the value of I see the value of being able to connect generations to each other. That is to say, if one is purely an individual and has no ties that are centered on blood, familial, tribal, whatever it may be, then you can be able to live in your own particular existence without a connection to the past nor a connection to the future. But what this law of inheritance teaches us is that we are bound to those connections and that we are within a chain of tradition, so that we must consider our past. We cannot get out of it. And we have a responsibility to the future, and we also cannot get out of it as well. It also speaks, I think, to the idea of why God, especially after the beginning of the Torah, and I have a whole sort of bit on this. If you want, this is actually my Yom Kippur sermon from this past year, part of my Yom Kippur sermon about how God adapted to humanity and tried different kind of relationships, different societies of what it means to build a human world, from Adam and Eve to Noah to the Tower of Babel, but eventually ended up with a single family, Abraham and Sarah, as being this unique tribe, and of using this tribe as a way to kind of exemplify to all of humanity how to live. But what's core to this notion of having a family as that example is that that family must persevere and must have a connection between one generation to the other. If that generation, if the older generation feels like I'm done, I don't want to be a part of it, then the ties are going to end and that experiment with Abraham is going to end. And if the children who were supposed to receive the inheritance say, I don't want it at all, then it's also going to end. So God's promise to Abraham is not just about, I will always be with you and your family, but that your family is always going to be connected to me. And a law like this emphasizes that connection to bring us all the way back even to Abraham's day, and to that promise that God made to Abraham, that I'm going to be with you and your family.
All right, I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much. Thanks for those who stayed a few more minutes because we got on a little late. Apologies for that. Always a pleasure to learn with you. Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you to all of you for the engagement and questions. I always learn both from our teachers and from you guys. And we will see you in this space on November 14th in exactly 1 week. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Take care.